Most shoppers pick up a jar of mayo, assuming it's harmless, a simple mix of eggs, oil and seasoning. But 5 brands on shelves right now are not what they appear. Some lean so heavily on water acidity boosters and stabilizers that the texture and flavor aren't the only things affected. When a product depends on aggressive formulation tricks, it can mean faster separation, shorter stability, and a higher chance of spoilage once opened. Others have been tied to official alerts involving contamination risks or undeclared allergens, the kinds of issues that can trigger real problems for families who rely on predictable, safe ingredients. This video goes straight to the facts. No drama, just clear information you rarely see printed on the label. Because when a product is used in sandwiches, salads, dips, and weekly meals, you deserve to know if something inside it makes it less stable, less honest, or less safe than you assume. Let's start with the jar that looks premium, yet hides the earliest red flag. Number 1. Waitrose mayonnaise with extra virgin olive oil. Waitrose mayonnaise with extra virgin olive oil looks like the safe premium choice in the mayonnaise aisle. The label leans hard on those words, extra virgin olive oil. The glass jar, the clean design, the supermarket reputation. Everything is telling you, pay a bit more, get something better. But the numbers on the back of the jar quietly tell a very different story, and once you see them, it is hard to unsee. Start with the headline number. The extra virgin olive oil that gives this jar its identity sits at around 5% of the recipe. Not 50, not even 20. 5. That means 95% of what you are buying is something else entirely cheaper. Base oils, water acidity, regulators, stabilizers. On the front, your eye lands on olive oil. On the back, the fraction shrinks down to a tiny percentage in a long list of ingredients. Legally correct, yes, but most shoppers are not doing the maths in the aisle. Now imagine how that plays out in a real kitchen. You pick this jar because you think olive oil makes it a smarter, more wholesome choice. Maybe you are trying to cut back on heavily processed seed oils. Maybe someone in your family has been told to be more careful with fats. You reach for the jar that sounds closer to a homemade blend. In reality, the bulk of the fat is still coming from the same type of cheaper refined oils you thought you were avoiding, just dressed up with a small drizzle of olive oil and a very big claim on the label. The health consequence is subtle, but it matters. When a product signals better or more natural, people use it more freely. A heaped spoon on a sandwich becomes 2 spoons. A little in a salad turns into a generous squeeze in a potato bake. Over weeks and months, that gap between what you think you are eating and what you are actually putting on the plate grows wider. You are not getting the olive oil heavy profile you assumed. You are still getting a blend built for cost and shelf life first, flavor and nutrition second. And that 5% figure connects to something else you can both see and taste. Independent taste tests have already called this jar out for underwhelming flavor and texture. When a mayonnaise leans so lightly on olive oil, yet charges a premium, it often ends up stuck in the middle, not rich enough to feel special, not simple enough to feel honest. In practice, that can mean a thinner mouthfeel, a sharper tang that leans on acidity regulators, and a mayo that breaks or loosens faster once the seal is broken. You notice it in everyday dishes. In a sandwich, the spread looks glossy on day one, then turns almost watery around the edges a few days later. In a coleslaw or potato salad, left out a bit too long at a family gathering, the dressing starts to slide off the vegetables instead of clinging. The emulsion is technically still there, but the structure feels fragile. When fat and water start to separate more easily, you are not just dealing with a cosmetic issue. A less stable product is more sensitive to time and temperature abuse, and that increases the risk of spoilage if people treat it like a sturdy, traditional mayo. Then there is the question of salt and sugar. To make a low olive oil mayonnaise feel satisfying, manufacturers often lean harder on seasoning to give back some punch. That can mean more salt, more sharpness, more bite, to distract from the fact that the core fat profile is not as generous as the front label suggests. For anyone watching blood pressure, weight, or general long-term health, those small nudges across many everyday products add up. A spoonful here, a spoonful there, all riding on an impression that this jar is somehow the better pick. The deeper issue, though, is trust. A lot of shoppers see the Waitrose name, see extra virgin olive oil, and feel safe enough to stop reading. That is how modern supermarkets work. You outsource some of the thinking to the brand. When you later find out that the hero ingredient barely makes an appearance in the recipe, it does not feel like a simple technicality. It feels like you have been steered into paying premium money for a budget structure with a luxury accent. And trust once chipped changes behavior. Some people respond by swinging the other way, deciding that all mayonnaise is the same and grabbing the cheapest jar next time. Others become suspicious of any product that highlights a specific ingredient. The small print on one label starts to colour how they see everything else in the aisle. An overclaimed 5% today can make them question whether any of the percentages on the shelf tomorrow are worth believing. The emotional hit is real, even if it is never dramatic. You thought you were making a slightly better choice for your family. You thought you were paying for quality stability and a different kind of fat profile. Instead, you learned that the jar you picked has already been called out for thin flavour, weak texture, and a recipe that leans more on presentation than substance. You are not in danger, but you are not getting what you believed you were buying. And that is the heart of why this mayonnaise belongs on an avoid list. Not because it is extreme or unsafe, but because the gap between the story on the front and the numbers on the back is too wide. When a brand trades on trust, those numbers matter. When the hero ingredient is more of a headline than a real presence in the jar, it is fair to ask what else is being optimized that you cannot see. If a premium-looking jar can stretch expectations this far, the next brand on this list goes even further, not just in how it is built, but in the shortcuts it normalizes on your table. Number 2. M&S Collection Mayonnaise. And after looking at Waitrose's olive oil claim collapsing under its own numbers, you might expect M&S, especially its premium collection line, to rise above that problem. It doesn't. The issue here is not a misleading percentage. It's the quiet letdown that begins the moment the lid lifts and keeps unfolding through every dish you try to build with it. The first sign is the flavour. You expect richness, a round creamy base, something that justifies the higher price and the elegant packaging. Instead, the taste swings hard toward acidity. The creaminess fades almost immediately, leaving a sharp edge that lingers longer than anything pleasant. Independent reviewers have already pointed this out. The vinegar-forward character overwhelms everything else. A premium mayo doesn't claw at your palate. It cushions it. This one pierces straight through. Texture tells a similar story. In the jar, it looks dense, luxurious, the kind of thickness you'd pay extra for. On the knife, it spreads thinner than expected, collapsing into a slick rather than a structured layer. In a potato salad, the dressing loosens halfway through mixing. In a simple chicken sandwich, it sinks into the bread instead of coating it. Whatever initial body it has seems to dissolve the moment it meets heat or moisture. You can watch the promise fall apart in real time. These sensory failures lead directly to the next question. Why does a mayo wearing its most premium badge behave like a standard shelf product? The answer sits in the formulation. A heavy acidic note often signals over-reliance on acidity regulators to force brightness and extend the feeling of freshness. That illusion lasts only seconds before turning harsh. The fading creaminess suggests a fat profile built more for appearance than performance, and the thinning effect in warm dishes hints at a stabilizer balance that doesn't hold under pressure. Once you spot the signs, the consequences become clearer. A mayo leaning this heavily on acidity changes how your stomach feels after larger portions, especially if you're sensitive to sharp dressings. A weaker emulsion breaks faster at room temperature, which quietly shortens the safe window at gatherings where dishes sit out longer than planned. And because the flavour pushes forward so aggressively, people often add more than they intended just to chase a sense of balance. More spoonfuls, more sodium, more richness that isn't really there. The illusion of premium quality plays a role in behaviour too. A mid-tier jar might make you cautious. A collection tier product encourages confidence. That confidence leads to generous servings, big spreads, and the assumption that the product underneath can withstand all of it. But when the structure is fragile, every overuse widens the distance between how you treat the mayo and how the mayo can actually perform. You think you're using a luxury blend. What you're actually using is something that just looks the part. This gap between expectation and reality is emotional as much as practical. Picture a family meal someone brings out deviled eggs or a layered dip expecting a smooth, rounded base. The flavor cuts too sharply. The texture sinks. The dish that was meant to feel dependable takes on a discordant note, and that moment of disappointment lands harder because it came wrapped in gold lettering. When a budget product misses the mark, you shrug. When a premium one produces the same result, it feels like a breach. Trust doesn't crumble in an instant. It erodes in the small ways shoppers never talk about, but always remember. The first time the acidity overpowers a simple sandwich. The second time the mayo breaks halfway through mixing a salad. The third time a dish looks dry at the edges because the dressing couldn't hold. These moments don't trigger outrage, but they stay with people. And once that erosion begins, it spreads to every product sitting beside it on the shelf, especially within a high-tier line. The problem deepens when you compare the price tag to the experience. You're paying extra for promised precision and performance, yet the result feels like a relabeled mid-range mayo with a more polished exterior. Premium products are supposed to reduce doubt, not amplify it. They're supposed to compensate for effort, not require more of it. When the opposite happens, shoppers pull away, not out of anger, but out of quiet resignation. If even this doesn't deliver, what else is worth trusting? And while nothing here signals danger, everything signals disappointment. A product marketed as indulgent shouldn't taste thin. A mayo, positioned as carefully crafted, shouldn't fall apart faster than the budget jars below it. A label carrying the weight of a premium line shouldn't lean so heavily on acidity to create the illusion of flavor. This is why M&S Collection Mayonnaise earns its place on the list. Not because it commits the same numerical sleight of hand as Waitrose, but because it represents a different failure, the failure to meet the standard its own branding sets. When a product invites you to expect more coming up short, feels worse than if it had never tried to look superior at all. And if a premium labeled jar can stumble this much, the next brand exposes an even clearer shortcut, one that doesn't bother hiding behind elegance or reputation, because the compromise sits openly in the recipe itself. Number 3. Stokes Real Mayonnaise. Stokes Real Mayonnaise enters the aisle with the kind of confidence that doesn't need to shout. The jar looks simple, honest, almost reassuring after two premium brands that promise more than they give. You expect something straightforward, something stable, something that doesn't dress itself up in claims it can't defend. And then the first sign appears, the mayo begins to separate. A thin layer of oil pulling away from the body, a watery sheen around the edge, a spoon lifting more liquid than cream. The moment it happens, the idea of real starts to feel like a label waiting to be tested. Separation is not a small cosmetic flaw. It signals a structural weakness in the emulsion itself. Mayonnaise is supposed to be one of the most stable dressings we use at home. Fat and water bind through patience, balance, and careful ratios. When that structure collapses inside the jar, it means the foundation was never strong enough to survive heat, moisture, or time. Stokes has been called out for this exact problem in independent reviews, not in rare edge cases, but in simple daily use. A mayo that breaks this easily reveals something about how it was built and what corners might have been trimmed to make it look thick in the jar while offering little resistance once the lid is lifted. Once the emulsion begins to fail, the consequences spread quickly. You open the jar on a warm day and see oil rising to the top. You stir it back together, but it doesn't hold. You try to use it in potato salad, and the dressing slides off the vegetables instead of coating them. A chicken wrap packed for lunch looks fine in the morning and wet by midday. A sandwich sitting out on a work counter starts leaking onto the bread. These are not extreme cases. They are ordinary habits. Lunch prep, family picnics, meal kits for the next day, the exact places where a stable mayo is supposed to shine. People underestimate how quickly a weak emulsion changes the food around it. When oil floats and water thins, the acidity no longer spreads evenly. Pockets form where protective pH isn't consistent. A dressing that should act as a buffer becomes unpredictable. And when something sits at room temperature even briefly, those inconsistencies matter. You don't feel the problem immediately, you only see that the mayo looks tired, loose, and older than it should be. But the deeper issue is the instability that allowed it to reach that point in the first place. This becomes even more important because of who buys Stokes. It's the jar chosen by people trying to avoid industrial shortcuts, people who want something that feels less processed, people who assume real means reliable. That assumption leads to generous use. Thick spreads, big spoonfuls, hearty layers in wraps and salads. When a product feels honest, you stop questioning it, and that trust shapes how you treat it in the kitchen. You leave it out a little longer. You pack it without ice. You stir it into leftovers without thinking about how long they will sit. Trust changes behavior before you even notice it. The problem is that this jar hasn't earned that trust. A mayo that breaks easily cannot behave like the sturdy, dependable version people assume it is. And once you begin to connect the dots, the watery edges, the slipping texture, the collapsing structure in warm dishes, you realize the product wasn't built to survive real conditions. It performs best in the jar, not in food. It performs best in theory, not in motion. It performs best as an idea, not as a partner in a family meal. There is also a quiet emotional shift. When a premium brand fails, you feel misled. When a mid-range everyday jar fails, you feel frustrated. When Stokes fails, the disappointment lands differently. It makes you question your own judgment. You picked it because it seemed trustworthy. You believed the simplicity. You trusted the branding more than the big supermarket names. So when that jar collapses, it feels like the kind of mistake anyone can make, the one that hides in plain sight, because nothing about it looks suspicious. Then the practical effect returns. A mayo that loses structure faster than others has a shorter margin of safety. Even if nothing is wrong when it leaves the factory, its ability to stay consistent under real household conditions is weaker. Meals warm up, lunchboxes sit in bags, picnic bowls stay uncovered longer than planned. A stable mayo buys you time, an unstable one removes that buffer. The risk doesn't come from a single ingredient. It comes from the behavior of the whole product once it leaves the comfort of a refrigerator. This is why Stokes belongs on the list. Not because it deceives you with numbers or disappoints you with luxury claims, but because it quietly normalizes a shortcut that becomes obvious only when things start to separate. A mayo that calls itself real should act real, steady, dependable, grounded. Instead, the structure breaks before you do anything wrong. And that is the kind of failure you cannot see until it is already happening in your food. If a mayo built on the idea of honesty can lose its structure before it even reaches the plate, the question becomes unavoidable. What does real actually mean when the moment of truth arrives? What remains of that promise once the emulsion breaks? Once the oil drifts away from the body? Once the product stops behaving like the thing it claims to be? A jar doesn't answer those questions. It just sits there looking the part, hoping you won't look too closely at what happens after it leaves the spoon. Number 4. Potts truffle mayonnaise. A customer in a well-known UK food forum summed it up perfectly. I opened the jar and it smelled fancy, but the taste felt manufactured. It wasn't a rant. It wasn't attention-seeking. It was the kind of blunt kitchen truth people share when a product tries to feel luxurious, but ends up revealing how much of that luxury is built in a workshop of processing steps. Potts truffle mayonnaise carries that problem from the first moment the lid comes off. The jar looks premium. The word truffle does most of the selling, yet what sits inside behaves less like mayonnaise and more like a small industrial project shaped through layers of added flavour stabilisation and aroma correction. The experience begins with the scent. It rises fast, almost staged, as if it were waiting at the surface, instead of coming from within the mayo. Real truffle builds gradually. Synthetic truffle hits immediately. Potts leans on concentrated aroma, compounds to create that rush, and the speed of the scent tells you more about the process than the ingredient. The flavour that follows doesn't develop or deepen. It arrives, peaks, then drops into a flat aftertaste, leaving the sense that the truffle and the mayonnaise never truly met. It's the flavour equivalent of two voices recorded on separate tracks. This is where the process shows itself. Instead of relying on genuine truffle depth, the jar stacks its effects. Stabilizers give the mayo a staged thickness. Infused oils stretch the flavour because the natural ingredient can't carry the load. Acidity regulators tidy up bitterness from the artificial truffle notes. Aroma boosters keep the impression alive after opening. Each addition compensates for the last. The result is not a flavour built from an ingredient, but a flavour built from a sequence. And that sequence influences everything you cook with it. Add it to warm potatoes, and the artificial aroma swells instead of softening. Fold it into coleslaw, and the truffle sits above the vegetables, refusing to blend. Spread it on bread, and you get scent first, mayo, second, no cohesion between them. Real luxury integrates itself into food. Manufactured layers compete with it. The over-engineering becomes even more noticeable in the texture. The mayo feels thick in the jar, but loses confidence once it meets heat or moisture. Infused oils behave differently from traditional mayonnaise fats. They loosen faster. They thin unpredictably. You can watch the structure slip as the aroma climbs. A luxury product shouldn't fade while becoming louder. Yet that is exactly what happens. The sensory balance breaks the moment it enters real life. Complex recipes also create complex vulnerabilities. A formula supported by stabilizers, infused oils, flavor compounds, and aroma masks relies on precision at every step. A small shift in storage conditions or ingredient intensity can throw the entire character off. Potts has already been involved in a product alert before, and while that specific case isn't the focus here, it illustrates how fragile a heavily engineered item can be. Simpler mayo fails gently. Overbuilt mayo fails sharply. Then comes the kitchen reality. Someone buys this jar to elevate a dish, a steak sandwich, a platter with chips, a festive spread. They expect indulgence. They expect depth. Instead, the mayo overwhelms the food. The truffle note rings louder than the dish itself. Luxury becomes noise. The product behaves like an aroma demonstration rather than an ingredient with purpose. You feel the distance between the marketing image and the eating experience more with each spoonful. The emotional effect isn't anger, it's recognition. You realize the jar didn't sell flavor, it sold construction. The premium feeling came not from real depth, but from the number of steps taken to imitate it. Once that becomes clear, everything about the product reads differently. The hit of aroma, the glossy texture, the quick fade of flavor. It all points back to the same truth. This mayo leans too heavily on process to deliver what the word truffle implies. And that opens the door to a larger problem in this aisle. If one jar can rely this much on engineered effects to create a sense of indulgence, what happens when a brand decides not to compensate at all? What happens when the shortcut is not about adding too much process, but about removing too much quality? The next mayonnaise on this list answers that question in a way that strips the category down to its bare minimum and exposes what cutting too far looks like on the spoon. Number 5. Heinz Seriously Good Mayonnaise. For the final brand, we come to one of the most recognizable jars in the world. Heinz Seriously Good Mayonnaise carries a name that sells confidence before you even twist the lid. The label doesn't ask for trust, it assumes it. Heinz built generations of loyalty with sauces that felt dependable, familiar, steady. That history creates a kind of comfort you don't think twice about, and that is what makes this jar so important to examine, because beneath its reputation lies a quiet change that shoppers only notice after months, not moments. The first shift appears in the texture. Older batches carried weight. They moved slowly off the spoon-held shape and wrapped themselves around food with a kind of natural fullness. Today, the mayo feels noticeably thinner. Slide a spoon through it, and the mixture levels itself too quickly, as if designed to spread fast rather than provide body. Put a small amount on bread, and it runs closer to the crust than expected. Stir it into a bowl of pasta, and the dressing begins to pool along the edges sooner than it should. None of this looks dangerous. It simply looks reduced. That reduction continues in the flavour. A good mayonnaise doesn't need to be bold to taste like something. It just needs presence, the soft depth of egg yolk, the subtle richness of oil, the understated acidity that ties it together. Heinz's recipe has lost some of that. The flavour starts neutral, but the neutrality feels hollow. You can sense where the richness used to sit. A faint sweetness drifts in where creaminess once lived. The aftertaste falls away too quickly, as if the formula has been trimmed back to meet a standard rather than to create an experience. Warm food exposes this even more clearly. Spread it on a toasted sandwich, and the mayo sinks into the bread instead of coating the surface. Stir it into a warm chicken salad, and the texture loosens immediately. Add it to a fresh tray of roasted vegetables, and the mayo thins faster than it builds. These behaviours point toward a fat blend adjusted for scale oils selected for consistency across millions of jars, rather than a richness that stands up in real imperfect home cooking. This is not about a single ingredient, it's about the philosophy behind the jar. As brands grow and production expands, recipes often shift in small, unannounced ways. A little less egg, a more neutral oil, a tightening of the emulsifier blend. Nothing dramatic, nothing that triggers a headline. But enough that after a few months, families begin to wonder why their sandwiches taste flatter, why their coleslaw looks wetter, why their potato salad feels a bit less satisfying. The change is gradual, the effect is steady, and the disappointment creeps in quietly, almost politely. The behavioural impact is subtle too. Because the flavour feels thin, people add more. A light spread becomes a heavy spread. A small spoon becomes two. Portions grow because the mayo no longer delivers the same fullness per bite. Over time, that means more sodium, more calories, more emulsifiers, all because the jar demands more to achieve the taste it once offered with less. Consumers end up compensating for a change they didn't choose. The emotional effect lands in a different place than the other brands on this list. When a premium jar fails, you feel misled. When a niche jar fails, you shrug. But when a household name feels diminished, something else happens. You feel the stability shift under your feet. Heinz was supposed to be the anchor. The jar that doesn't cut corners. The jar that doesn't compromise. The jar you can grab with your eyes closed because it always tastes like itself. And suddenly you realize it doesn't. This is where trust begins to thin. Not dramatically, not with outrage, but with a small, steady erosion. Each time a family recipe tastes a little less satisfying, each time the texture doesn't hold, each time the mayo melts too quickly in a warm dish, the gap between memory and reality widens. You start to wonder whether the jar has changed or whether your palate has, and deep down you know it isn't you. This is why Heinz, seriously good, earns its place here. The issue isn't safety instability or manufacturing excess. The issue is quality drift, the slow, quiet shift from richness to mass compatibility. A mayo that once stood out now blends into the middle. A jar that promised seriously good now tastes closer to seriously adjusted. And for a brand this iconic, the slide is more noticeable than the label wants to admit. And that leaves one final thought before moving into the better side of this aisle. If a jar this trusted can slip through tiny compromises until it becomes something entirely different, which brands still refuse to take that path? Which jars still hold their shape, their flavour and their integrity in a world where shortcuts are easy? Those are the ones worth keeping. And they prove that mayonnaise can still be simple, satisfying and genuinely honest when brands choose not to let it drift. In the end, mayonnaise isn't about trend branding or the clever language printed on a label. It's about what actually happens on the plate, the stability, the flavour, the honesty of a recipe that doesn't need to hide behind shortcuts. This aisle is crowded with promises, yet only a few jars still hold the line. The rest drift, some quickly, some so slowly you only notice when a familiar dish stops tasting the way it used to. But awareness changes everything. When you know what to look for, you shop differently, you choose differently, you expect differently, and brands feel that pressure more than they admit. Because every stable emulsion, every clean ingredient list, Every honest jar is a reminder that quality isn't complicated, it's a decision. If there's one message to take from this list, it's simple: you deserve better mayo, and the good ones prove it every day.
This video does not promote division within the United States or encourage education. All content is presented for the purpose of exploration, analysis, and fostering discussion based on current events, public sentiment, and social trends. We fully respect the United States Constitution and all federal regulations. If today analysis made you think, drop a comment so we can keep the conversations going. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you will never miss our next independent deep dive.